Hello, everybody. As we wrap up this unit, we are going to take a look at another proxy war of the Cold War era. As a reminder, the United States and the Soviet Union had been locked in bitter conflict since the end of World War II. At that point, the two conflicting ideologies, democracy and communism, led to increasing tensions at an all-time high, as both tried to spread their ideologies across the globe. But in this Cold War, there was no actual fighting. Instead, both countries involved themselves in what we call proxy wars, where they fought on other countries' behalves. The United States became involved in this proxy war in Vietnam during the era as part of its containment policy against communism. The U.S. supported South Vietnam against the communist North Vietnam, fearing the spread of communism in Southeast Asia. The conflict escalated, leading to a long and controversial war from 1955 all the way to 1975. As you are listening and taking notes, you should focus on the following essential question. What was the United States' involvement in the Vietnam War? Several years before the United States and the Soviet Union became involved in Vietnam, conflict was already brewing in Indochina. In 1954, at the International Conference at Geneva, to try and solve some of this conflict, Vietnam was divided along the 17th parallel into two separate regions, the North controlled by communist forces led by Ho Chi Minh, and the South supported by anti-communist powers under Ngo Dinh Diem. This division was intended to be temporary, with elections scheduled for 1956 to reunify the country. However, the agreed-upon nationwide elections did not occur as planned due to escalating Cold War tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union. The fear was that Ho Chi Minh, the North Vietnamese leader and a communist figure, would win, leading to a unified Vietnam under communist rule. This concern led the United States to intervene in support of the South Vietnamese government, eventually escalating into the Vietnam War that lasted for years. The United States chose to intervene here for several reasons. One key factor was the U.S. policy of containment aimed at stopping the spread of communism. The domino theory, or fear that one country falling to communism would lead to others in the region following suit, was a major factor. The U.S. sought to support the democratic government in South Vietnam because of our economic interests and the desire to maintain a strategic military presence in Southeast Asia, which we could not do if Vietnam was under communist rule. However, as strongly as our leaders felt about our involvement, Americans held widely varying opinions on the conflict. Initial support for the war was relatively high, with many viewing it as a necessary measure to contain the spread of communism. However, as the war dragged on and casualties mounted, public sentiment shifted. A growing number of Americans began to question the reasons for U.S. involvement, leading to widespread anti-war protests across the country. The war became increasingly unpopular, with many feeling disillusioned and questioning the government's motives. This period marked a significant divide in American society, with debates on the war's legitimacy continuing long after its conclusion. Demonstrations became a prominent form of protest against U.S. involvement in the conflict. Young people, including college students, played a significant role in these protests, organizing rallies, marches, and sit-ins to express their opposition to the war. One notable example is the March on the Pentagon in 1967, where thousands of protesters gathered to show their opposition. Another famous demonstration was the Kent State shootings in 1970, where 4 students were killed by the National Guard during a protest. Student activists and ordinary citizens participated in these demonstrations to express their discontent with the war, calling for peace and the withdrawal of troops from Vietnam. These examples of anti-war protests played a significant role in shaping public opinion and influencing government decisions during the conflict. The movement brought together people from diverse backgrounds who believed in the power of peaceful protest to enact change and challenge the status quo. To get a better understanding about why Americans felt so strongly about ending the United States' involvement in the war, we need to look at some policies developed during this time. The Gulf of Tonkin Resolution was a pivotal moment in American history and one of those unpopular decisions. The resolution was sparked by two reported attacks on United States naval vessels by North Vietnamese forces in the Gulf of Tonkin in 1964. First, a U.S. destroyer patrolling in the Gulf of Tonkin reported North Vietnamese torpedo boats had fired on it. Then, 2 days later, another attack was reported, although no evidence could confirm that it actually happened. As a result, the United States Congress passed the resolution giving President Lyndon B. Johnson the authority to take military action without a formal declaration of war. This is significant because prior to, the president could not declare war and could not take military action without approval from Congress. This marked a significant escalation of United States involvement in Vietnam. Less than a year later, Operation Rolling Thunder was a major sustained bombing campaign conducted by the United States. It aimed to weaken the enemy's ability to wage war by targeting military and industrial sites in North Vietnam. Carpet bombing was a military strategy used during this time where large areas were targeted with heavy bombing to destroy enemy forces and infrastructure. This tactic involved dropping a large number of bombs across a wide area without aiming at specific targets. The goal was to inflict maximum damage and disrupt enemy operations. Napalm and Agent Orange were used. Napalm involved jellied gasoline, which burned violently, and Agent Orange killed plants over the jungles. While it was intended to weaken the enemy's morale and ability to fight, carpet bombing also caused significant harm to civilians and the environment, leading to widespread devastation in Vietnam during the war. The operation lasted from 1965 to 1968. Despite its strategic goals, Operation Rolling Thunder faced criticism for its limited success in achieving its objectives and generating civilian casualties, contributing to anti-war sentiments both at home and abroad. On the other side of the battlefield, the Viet Cong played a significant role in the conflict. Short for Vietnamese Communists, the Viet Cong were a group of guerrilla fighters in South Vietnam who fought against the government of South Vietnam and the United States. They were supporters of North Vietnam's communist government and aimed to reunify the country under communist rule. The Viet Cong used tactics such as ambushes, booby traps, and hit-and-run attacks to combat the larger and better equipped American forces. They were skilled at blending in with the local population, which made it challenging for the enemy to distinguish between civilians and fighters. This strategy allowed the Viet Cong to launch surprise attacks and then disappear quickly, making it difficult for their opponents to retaliate. One of the Viet Cong's most infamous tactics was the use of underground tunnels. These elaborate networks of tunnels provided shelter, communication routes, and storage for the fighters. The tunnels were well hidden and complex, making it hard for the enemy to detect and destroy them. This tactic gave the Viet Cong a strategic advantage in moving troops and supplies. The Viet Cong were known for their resilience and determination in the face of adversity. Despite facing a technologically advanced and well-equipped enemy, they continued to fight fiercely for their cause. Their commitment to their ideology and their willingness to endure hardships made them a formidable opponent in the war. The Tet Offensive was a major military campaign during the Vietnam War that took place in 1968. It was launched by the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong forces against the South Vietnamese and United States military. The offensive began on January 30th, 1968, during the Vietnamese New Year holiday known as Tet. The goal of the Tet Offensive was to strike military and civilian command centers throughout South Vietnam. The attacks took place in more than 100 cities, towns, and military installations across South Vietnam. One of the most significant aspects of the offensive was the attack on the U.S. Embassy in Saigon, the capital of South Vietnam. This attack shocked many Americans who believed the war was going well. The Tet Offensive is considered a turning point in the Vietnam War for several reasons. Despite suffering heavy losses, the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces were able to launch a coordinated and widespread attack that caught the South Vietnamese and U.S. military off guard. The offensive also exposed the U.S. government's earlier optimistic assessments of the war's progress as being inaccurate. The Tet Offensive led to a change in public opinion in the United States regarding the war. Many Americans began to question the government's handling of the conflict and the credibility of its statements about the war. The Tet Offensive also weakened popular support for the war effort, both in the United States and internationally. Richard Nixon was elected as the 37th President of the United States in 1968. One of the key issues during his campaign was the Vietnam War, which had been going on for several years. Nixon promised to end the war in a way that would bring peace with honor to the United States. One of Nixon's strategies to end the Vietnam War was to gradually withdraw American troops from Vietnam while training and equipping the South Vietnamese army to take over the fight against the North Vietnamese forces. This policy was known as Vietnamization. By reducing the number of American troops in Vietnam, Nixon hoped to shift the burden of combat to the South Vietnamese forces. In total, he promised to remove 25,000 of the 543,000 U.S. ground troops in Vietnam by the end of the year. In 1973, the United States and North Vietnam signed the Paris Peace Accords, which called for a ceasefire and the withdrawal of all American troops from Vietnam. This agreement marked the official end of U.S. involvement in the Vietnam War. Sadly, the peace did not last long, and in 1975, North Vietnam overran South Vietnam, leading to the fall of Saigon and the unification of Vietnam under communist rule. Although the Vietnam War did not end as Nixon had hoped, his presidency marked a significant moment in U.S. history. The election of Richard Nixon and the subsequent end of the Vietnam War had a lasting impact on American politics and society, shaping the way Americans viewed their government and their country's role in international conflicts. As I mentioned before, the fall of Saigon took place on April 30th, 1975, marking the end of the Vietnam War. It was a significant event where North Vietnamese troops captured Saigon, the capital of South Vietnam, leading to the reunification of Vietnam under communist rule. The fall of Saigon resulted in the evacuation of American personnel and South Vietnamese citizens, signaling a new chapter in Vietnamese history. This event had lasting effects both on the people of Vietnam and the global political landscape. The impact on American policy of the Vietnam War was great. First, we get the 26th Amendment lowering the voting age to 18 years old. This allowed more of the American population to have a say in who is making choices for them in their government. Second, Nixon abolished the draft to create an all-volunteer army, and he announced that he would not be seeking another term for president. Third, the War Powers Act of 1973 required the president to notify Congress within 48 hours of deploying military force. He no longer had the power to make military action without congressional approval. It also stated that the president must withdraw forces unless he gains congressional approval within 90 days. Despite the vast resources and troops sent by the U.S., the Vietnam War ended in defeat for the United States, resulting in the reunification of North and South Vietnam. The war had a lasting impact on both countries and shaped U.S. foreign policy for years to come. Take a moment to reflect on our essential question for today. What was the United States' involvement in the Vietnam War?